Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
I gotta say, April's off to an interesting start. Any April Fool's gifts show up at your door today, or any weird surprises waiting?
I was kind of half expecting my phone to suddenly switch to Spanish or something.
Yeah.
Just completely useless for the day. But so far, nothing, thankfully. What about you? Any prank calls yet?
It's been pretty quiet over here, too, actually. Maybe everyone's just running out of ideas, you know?
Right.
But speaking of gifts, we actually got a question from one of you guys that fits right in with today. Someone asked, did China really send an aircraft carrier to, circle Taiwan as an April Fool's gift?
Oh, wow.
That sounds a little intense, right?
Yeah, it definitely has a dramatic feel to it for sure. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page, April Fool's Day is that unofficial holiday on April 1st where people play harmless pranks, try to trick each other just for fun, right?
Yeah.
You can have to look at everything today with a little bit of, is this for real,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that moment when you have to question every email, every headline, is my coffee secretly decaf? All the important stuff.
Exactly. Now, where did this all come from? Well, one popular idea connects it back to the 1500s in France when they changed their calendar and moved New Year's Day from around late March, early April to January 1st. So the people who were a little slow to catch on and still celebrated in April, they got teased as April Fools.
Oh, so it's basically making fun of the people who didn't get the memo. Got it.
Pretty much, yeah. There's also a possible connection to this medieval thing called the Feast of Fools, which was a lot more wild and chaotic, and some people even think it ties into the unpredictable spring weather, like nature kind of fooling you with a sudden snowstorm after a nice warm day. But the main thing is April 1st. Take everything with a grain of salt.
Okay, so with all that in mind, what's the real story with China and Taiwan on this April 1st?
Well, there are reports out there that China's Shandong aircraft carrier did show up in the waters near Taiwan.
Yeah.
Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense even put out a statement saying that this carrier group entered their air defense identification zone on Monday, and they responded by sending out their own aircraft and ships to keep an eye on things.
So this wasn't just a rumor going around, there was actual movement happening.
Yeah, absolutely. We're also seeing reports from reliable sources like Reuters and Al Jazeera about military exercises that China conducted in the seas north, south, and east of Taiwan, specifically on April 1st. They're calling it a warning against separatism. And there's even video footage out there supposedly showing the Shandong in action.
Okay, so our listener asked specifically if they encircled Taiwan. Did this carrier or these exercises actually make a full circle around the island?
Well, the information we have right now shows a presence near Taiwan and these exercises taking place. Whether it was a complete encirclement, literally drawing a circle around the whole island, that's not confirmed for sure beyond reports from Chinese state media. It's something to watch as more news comes out. But the important takeaway is that there was definitely some serious military activity going on.
Got it. So maybe not a perfect circle, but definitely a noticeable and, potentially intimidating presence. Now, one of our sources used a really interesting phrase describing China using this aircraft carrier as a form of wish, which is deterrence against Taiwan. They said it was like taking a cannon to a melee fight. Can you break that down for us? What does that even mean in this situation?
That's a great way to put it, actually. It really gets to the core of the strategy here. Think about the geography of the Taiwan Strait. It's pretty narrow on average, about 110 miles wide, and at its narrowest point, it's less than 80 miles. Aircraft carriers like the Shandong are built for what's called blue water operations, meaning missions far out in the ocean against other big navies or to support operations in other parts of the world. Their weapons and the range of their aircraft are all designed for those longer distances.
So it's like bringing this huge long-range weapon to a fight that's happening basically right next door.
Exactly. In a tighter space like the Taiwan Strait, especially with Taiwan being so close to the Chinese coast, the advantages of an aircraft carrier are just much less significant. For something like this, land-based aircraft missiles and smaller ships are often more effective and honestly cheaper to use.
That makes sense. It's kind of like trying to use a bazooka to kill a fly, total overkill and not the best tool for the job.
Exactly. And then there are the risks to the aircraft carrier itself being in that narrow strait. It becomes a much easier target for things like Taiwan's anti-ship missiles. They have some pretty powerful ones like their Chongfeng series and even submarines. It's a big, slow-moving target when it's that close to shore.
So if it's not the most efficient military option, why do it? What message is China trying to send by deploying a carrier like this? What should you be taking away from this?
Well, that's where the psychological and political side of things comes in. Putting an aircraft carrier in that area is a very visible show of force. It sends a strong signal to both Taiwan and the rest of the world about China's capabilities and their willingness to use them. It's more about projecting strength and trying to discourage Taiwan from moving towards independence than it is about being the main weapon in an actual fight.
So it's like a really big, intimidating billboard saying, hey, world, look what we can do.
Yeah, you could say that. And, our source even pointed out that the size of the aircraft carrier could make it an easier target for close-range rockets from Taiwan. It's a big target that can't move very quickly in a confined space.
Wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. And it gets even a little stranger. Our source mentioned some people online were joking that the aircraft carrier was actually there to pick up mainland spouses who'd been kicked out of Taiwan.
Yeah, that definitely adds a layer of dark humor to the whole thing.
Uh-huh.
It shows how some people see this as a bit absurd, deploying such a massive piece of military hardware for what seems like a more localized issue.
Right. Okay, so we've got China conducting these military exercises, and they're calling them joint exercises. Now, usually when we hear joint exercises, we think of multiple countries working together, right? Is that what's happening here? Is China teaming up with someone else for these drills?
That's a really good point to clarify. When China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA, Eastern Theater Command, calls these exercises joint, they mean joint in the sense of involving different parts of the Chinese military. So we're talking Army, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, different parts of their own military working together.
Okay, so it's more about internal coordination, like practicing how their different military branches can operate together as one.
Exactly. It's about testing their joint operational capabilities, how well all these different parts of their military can coordinate and function as a single unit. It's not the same as what we usually mean by joint exercises internationally, which usually means cooperation between the militaries of two or more countries, like when the U.S. does joint exercises with Japan or South Korea.
Right, that makes a lot more sense. So when we hear about China doing joint exercises, we shouldn't automatically assume they're working with another country. It's all happening within their own military structure.
Right. Everything we've seen so far says it's just China's own forces participating, including that Shandong carrier group, fighter jets, warships, no mention of anyone else involved. It's like, as our source put it, China's joint is like joining forces with itself.
I like the joining forces with itself. Okay, so we've covered the April Fool's Day angle. China's military moves the cannon to a melee idea and clarified what joint exercises really means in this case. Let's shift gears a bit. Our sources also talked about why someone like Trump purposely avoid making a big policy announcement like new tariffs on April 1st. What's the logic behind that?
It makes a lot of sense when you think about what April Fool's Day is all about.
Yeah.
Imagine announcing a serious, potentially impactful policy like tariffs on April 1st. People would immediately question whether it was real or not. They might just dismiss it as a joke, which would completely undermine the seriousness of the announcement. Like, what if he came out today and said, we're putting a huge tax on imported coffee? The first thing people would think is, wait, is this a prank?
Right, you'd lose all the intended impact. Nobody would take it seriously. So I guess the takeaway for our listeners is even the timing of an announcement can make a huge difference in how seriously it's taken.
Exactly. And tariffs are a big deal. They affect economies, trade relationships, the prices you pay for things.
Mm-hmm.
So for a policy like that, it's crucial for the announcement to be taken seriously by everyone, allies, adversaries, the markets. Announcing it on April Fool's Day just creates too much risk of that message getting lost or misinterpreted.
And with all the fake news and jokes floating around on April 1st, a real policy announcement could easily get buried.
Yeah, exactly. Waiting until April 2nd, assuming that's the plan, lets the announcement stand on its own without all that April Fool's Day confusion. Our source also tied this back to Trump's history with trade policies and his campaign promises about putting tariffs on China and other countries. Announcing tariffs on April 2nd could be a way to make news early in the new fiscal year and show he's following through on those promises.
So it's all about making sure the message gets through loud and clear. But, our source did bring up an interesting point. Could Trump's team delaying the announcement itself be a kind of April Fool's move, given how he likes to be dramatic?
That's very Trumpian thought, isn't it? The meta prank? It's definitely possible knowing how he operates.
All right, before we dive into some of the bigger implications of all this April 1st stuff, we want to quickly shout out a friend of the show, Micky. He's got a great YouTube channel called Mickytolife.
Oh yeah, Micky's awesome. Definitely check him out, guys.
For real, you should. He's got a really cool mix of content going on. He does travel vlogs, so if you're thinking about your next vacation, you can see the world through his eyes. Plus, if you're into trying new drinks, the adult kind of drinks, he does whiskey and alcohol unboxings where he tries all sorts of interesting stuff. Yeah. I remember one time he tried this super rare scotch, and his reaction was hilarious.
And he posts his own music too, right?
Yeah.
I remember him saying he's been working on some new tracks.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. So whether you're planning a trip, looking for a new cocktail to try, or just want to hear some good music, head over to YouTube and search for Mickytolife. You won't be disappointed. Oh, I remember this other time Micky was in, I think it was Thailand, and he ate some really interesting street food. Okay, back to our deep dive. We've been talking about China's military actions happening on April Fool's Day, and it really shows this strange overlap between potentially serious international politics and a day that's all about silly jokes.
Absolutely. Our source even brought up the example of the Hainan Island incident back in 2001, where a U.S. spy plane and a Chinese fighter jet collided. That happened on April 1st, too. It was a really tense situation, and some people at the time were calling it an April Fool's international joke, even though it was obviously a very serious event. It just shows how the date itself can create this weird feeling when important things happen.
It's like the world briefly loses its sense of what's real and what's not. So what if Trump had actually announced those tariffs on April 1st? Do you think it would have caused real confusion in the markets with people not knowing if it was a real policy or just a prank?
It's very possible.
Yeah.
I think the initial reaction would have been a lot of skepticism and probably some instability in the markets as people tried to figure out what was going on. And it raises an interesting question. Could a country or a leader intentionally use April Fool's Day to their advantage to create confusion or spread disinformation? That's a bit of a scary thought.
Yeah, that's a little unsettling. So we talked about the showcase project aspect of China's aircraft carriers. They have 3 now, the Liaoning, the Shandong, and the newer, more advanced Fujian.
Like we discussed, they could be vulnerable to Taiwan's defenses, like those anti-ship missiles and submarines, especially if the U.S. is providing intelligence support. It makes you think maybe the main purpose of these deployments is more about showing off their strength and resolve than actually being the key to winning a fight.
So more of a statement than a practical military advantage in that particular scenario?
It seems that way, yeah. Now, if Trump were to go ahead with those tariffs, like we discussed earlier, the effects on the global economy could be pretty big. Our source mentioned that China might retaliate with their own tariffs on U.S. agricultural products like soybeans and corn, which could really hurt American farmers just like it did during those trade wars a few years ago.
Yeah, the farming community has definitely been caught in the crossfire before. And then there's Taiwan's role as a major producer of semiconductors. How do you think they might be affected if they get squeezed between U.S. tariffs on Chinese tech and their own production?
It's a tough situation for Taiwan. They're a major player in the semiconductor industry, which is essential for companies all over the world, including in both the U.S. and China. More tariffs could really mess up global supply chains and force Taiwanese companies to make some tough choices. It's hard to say exactly how they'd respond, but they'd probably try to find a way to protect their own economic interests while also trying to maintain good relationships with both the U.S. and China.
It's a complicated web for sure. You know, our source had a funny thought about this. They were wondering if companies might use April Fool's Day to poke fun at the tariffs with fake discount announcements. Like, tariffs are here, but don't worry, everything's 90% off. Just kidding.
Haha, that's the kind of sarcastic humor you definitely see online. It'd be a way for companies and consumers to let off some steam about the economic impacts without getting too serious about it.
It's interesting how these serious global issues can sometimes bump up against the lightheartedness of a day like April Fool's. It makes you think about other historical events that have happened in the spring. Our source mentioned the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia back in 1999, which also happened in April. Is April just a historically eventful month?
It does seem like it, right? Whether there's a real pattern there or just a coincidence is hard to say. But our source also made a good point about the practical side of things. Springtime usually means better weather and sea conditions, which could be a factor in choosing when to do military exercises. That could be part of the reason for China's actions on April 1st, beyond any political motivations.
Right. It makes sense. You wouldn't want to plan big naval exercises in the middle of a storm if you can avoid it. Okay, so let's lighten things up again since it is April Fool's Day. Let's do a little hypothetical prank brainstorming, but with a global politics twist. If you were the Chinese Navy, what kind of harmless prank could you pull on Taiwan?
Let me think. Maybe they could stage a fake we're out of fuel situation with the Shandong right in the middle of the Taiwan Strait, just to see how everyone reacts. Send out a mock SOS call.
Oh, that's good. Watch the news channels go crazy for a few hours. Okay, my turn. If you were Trump, would you post a fake tweet on April Fool's Day about tariffs? Something totally outrageous, but obviously a joke, just to see what happens.
Knowing Trump, he might tweet something like, just announced huge tariffs on, wait for it air. Everyone has to pay to breathe now, April Fools, and then delete it 5 minutes later and pretend it never happened.
Oh, man. That is so something he would do. The chaos would be epic. Okay, well, this has been a pretty wild conversation. Let's wrap things up here.
All right, so we've got China conducting military exercises near Taiwan on April Fool's Day, which definitely raises some interesting questions. The idea that their aircraft carrier is like a cannon in a melee fight really illustrates how these big military displays are sometimes more about making a political statement than having a real tactical advantage in a situation like the Taiwan Strait. We also clarified that when China talks about joint exercises, they're talking about different branches of their own military working together, not necessarily with other countries. And we discussed why someone like Trump might avoid making big policy announcements like tariffs on April 1st to make sure the message is taken seriously and not seen as some kind of joke.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, here's something to think about as you go about your day. Considering how serious global events can sometimes intersect with a day like April Fool's Day, which is all about pranks and misinformation, what other seemingly contradictory things might we see happen on this date in the future? Or, going back to that cannon to a melee analogy, what are some other areas of life where we see people using way more force or effort than necessary? And what are the real reasons behind it? It's always good to look beyond the surface and think about the motivations behind the things happening in the world.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.